Hello there, friends. Welcome to BJJ Meditations. This is BJJ Meditations, episode number 41. I'm your host, Joe Hannon. Joe from Jersey, one of the partners at Princeton Brazilian Jiu Jitsu in Princeton, New Jersey, probably better known as the school brought to this world by Emily Kwok. Wasn't able to do a show last week due to just life being crazy. I tried the ambitious goal for this show was to always do an episode every week forever. Sometimes it's just not realistic. So I do my best to live up to that commitment that I made with myself. Sometimes I make it, sometimes I break it. That's just the reality of things in the world of BJJ Meditations here. But ultimately, the mission is the same, to give you good jiu-jitsu related content and ideas and thoughts about life on and off the mats on as regular of a basis as I can. But just had this steady stream of messages from people who have been listening to the podcast lately and people who heard my appearance on BJJ Mental Models. People have been listening to the show I've been doing with Emily called The Highest Levels, which is sort of taking our frameworks from the peak consulting space and applying them to jiu-jitsu, kind of giving you guys a look under the hood of how we do things, how we think about things. There's just been such a tremendous response to all of that, and I still have a lot of crap going on. Wouldn't be a BJJ Meditations episode without one of my eyes being messed up. This time, my left eye, I think I have pink eye, just why I'm, after a brief stint of wearing contacts, I'm back to glasses, at least a new pair of glasses, new prescription, so I can see a little bit better. But yeah, all of that incoming messaging has just filled me with this overwhelming sense of gratitude and just a desire to continue giving you guys information that's hopefully useful. So carving out the time to sit down and talk today. This is going to be a strange episode for me. It's one that the very thought of talking about these things is very uncomfortable for me, which is usually a pretty strong indicator that it's a good thing to talk about. So yeah, it's going to be indirectly jiu-jitsu related, seemingly superficially about my experience with hunting, being a lifelong hunter. Well, not lifelong. I started hunting at the age of 10, which is the age you can legally hunt in the state of New Jersey. And just my mixed feelings about hunting in general, and then this wild experience I had over the weekend, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about. But I ask you, if you haven't shut the episode off already, to at least suspend some judgment for the next 20 minutes or so here and hear me out, both on the subject of hunting and on the subject of how this relates to jiu-jitsu and life performance in the various domains of life writ large, because I think there's some at least interesting ideas to entertain here. So yeah, let's just get right into it. Episode 41, I've called this one The Hunt. And before I actually get into the experience from this past weekend, let me just kind of set the stage for you a little bit here. When it comes to the things that I do professionally, I have several hats that I wear. There's my role as a consultant in the peak performance space with Emily. We both work for Josh Waitskin. I'm still very much a professional content creator too, professional writer. I do a lot of writing in the medical space, a lot of writing for clinicians, so very technical writing about diseases and medications and stuff like that. And then, of course, I have my partnership at the school, where I'm more of like a traditional business manager type of person. And then there's all this other creative stuff I do, like BJJ Meditations and my personal writing, which I kind of just do to scratch my own creative itch. It really doesn't make me any money or anything like that. It's just kind of this way I go about expressing myself. And for the past few months, really, I've just been feeling kind of lopsided. Like everything outside of my work with, say, Emily in the peak consulting space has just been flowing. Everything's been going really well, and I feel like I've been able to execute. And I feel like I'm kind of working just at the edge of my core competencies. And I think that's what Mikhail Solzhenitsyn, I believe that's how he would pronounces his name. I forget, but he's the guy who pioneered a lot of the research on flow. I believe he says that's kind of the definition of being in flow, is that you're doing something that's just the right amount of challenging, that's forcing you to level up. And that stretch is taking you out of your head and you're fully committed to the moment as it's unfolding and operating at that dynamic edge of your capabilities. So I'm very much feeling that right now in my jiu-jitsu. I'm developing a lot of passing stuff, particularly single leg staple passing, circle passing. It's really alive for me in a big way right now, and it's working really well, at least within my school. I don't know how it'll work on the competitive level, to be determined. But this is all coming from my experience at Masters Worlds. I really struggled with this. I'm taking it on and I'm studying it deliberately, practicing it deliberately. So that's kind of at a state of flow. It's beautiful. The school, at least from my perspective, also in a state of flow. I'm being asked to generate new systems, operate with different pieces of software that I haven't before. I'm being asked to be a leader. Like for the past 6 years or so, it's been an army of one here. It's been my business, Kid 8 Creative Content. I've been catering to clients mostly in the medical space, as I said, creating things for them. And it's really just me. I don't manage anybody but myself. And prior to that in my career, I was a manager in the newspaper business, and I think I was a really shitty manager. I think that I did a really poor job of leading people. I think that I was very just egocentric. I had a lot of growing up to do and a lot of unlearning to do. And I feel like I've spent the past 6 years doing that growing up and unlearning. And now I'm being able to put all of those lessons into play in the school. And the chief lesson of it all, which I've derived from the book Tribal Leadership, is really just what it actually means to be a we-centered organization, and changing my relationship to that organization, changing how I manage it, and like really taking myself out of it completely. That's been the dynamic growth edge of the school. So that's been flowing for me really well. And really in the peak performance consulting space section, like I can't really get into the specifics of like a lot of what's going on, but I've just felt like an awkward teenager all over again. Like I've intellectually and physically, I've just felt completely disembodied and completely in over my head and struggling at times and not trusting my instincts, not trusting my abilities, like suffering from this imposter syndrome. And it's like a very weird, disorienting experience because in these other domains, everything's just flowing beautifully. And I feel like I'm executing exactly how I should be. But then in this like one other domain, I'm like, man, what the fuck is going on here? Like, why can't I get this together? I feel very much like I'm not at home in my own body or in my own head. And this has kind of been going on for a while. And fortunately, Josh and Emily are both just so supportive and so beautiful. And they've both said to me, like, this is the nature of the work. Like, this is the nature of taking your shit on. Like, none of us really know what we're doing here. So we're figuring it out, and we're going to figure it out together in this beautiful and dynamic way. And like, don't take it personally. So it's one thing to say that and get it intellectually, and it's another to feel it here. So all this to say is like all this shit was just swirling for me last week in a big way, and I needed time away. I needed separation from everything you see in these four walls in my office, this camera that I'm looking into, this laptop that I'm staring at with my notes here in front of me. All of this is very confining. I remember listening years ago, I don't even remember the woman's name, but she was this researcher on human movement. And she described all of these things that surround us as castes. They're not like casts, like the caste system, but like a cast, like you've broken your arm and you need a cast. They're confining. Like, for example, my eyes, I have astigmatism in part because it's genetic, but in part because my eyes have been accustomed to looking at things like no farther away than my hand. Right? So the shape of my eye has changed because it's been conforming to this cast that is things that are typically at a distance within a walled environment. So I really think that, as I've mentioned before on BJJ Mental Models and on this podcast, it behooves all of us to have an ecology of practices. So jiu-jitsu is your movement practice. You might have some introspective practice like meditation. You might have what I like to call an extrospective practice. That's something that inspires awe. And for me, that's been time in nature and specifically hunting. I've been hunting since I was 10 years old, which is the legal age in the state of New Jersey. And I think I killed my first deer at age 11. Um, and so my story as a hunter is kind of unconventional. Like, hunting is not exactly a big pastime here in the state of New Jersey, but this is part of the state where I grew up in. If I were to like just drop you in the middle of the woods in a helicopter and tell you you were in West Virginia or like in the Great Smoky Mountains or something like that, you would believe me. Like, you'd have no frame of reference. If you walked in a straight line for a couple of miles in the woods, like eventually you would hit a road and you'd realize that the wilderness you were in wasn't as big as you thought it was, but it truly was and is a wilderness. Regularly, as a child, like, my way of having fun was getting on my mountain bike with a friend or with alone and riding out into the woods. And I would have encounters with bears, coyotes, two animals that generally, coyotes are not, they're very docile and skittish for the most part. If you're a small dog or mammal, you might have a problem, but with people, they don't really care. But you can have dangerous encounters with black bears. Like, there was a Rutgers University student who was killed a few years ago, not far from where I grew up. So all this to say is that I had a very woodsy upbringing as a child, and these things were normal to me, and it was normal to hunt. It was normal to go fishing. It was normal to go camping. And then New Jersey's a small state, but it's culturally diverse and rich, and everybody has different experiences depending on where you grew up. And I went to the College of New Jersey, which is a state school. It's located just outside of Trenton, and I was there with people from mostly all over the state. And I just realized right away, like, what an atypical New Jersey experience I had, and felt all this shame, which is kind of a crazy thing to say. I felt all this shame about my upbringing. Like, I felt like a redneck, like I was like seen as white trash for hunting, for killing animals, for owning firearms, for owning a bow. And a lot of this was self-imposed. It wasn't really coming mostly from outside, but yeah, I felt like I was seen in a certain way for having these experiences, for better or worse. And it was a part of myself that I kept to myself for a long time, really, until recently, to the point where there was a long time where, like, I didn't go out. I want to say, like, from my freshman year of college up until 2021, it was the pandemic that got me back out into the woods again. I felt like I was getting sucked so far down this reality distortion tunnel that was the news and information landscape of the time. And I didn't have my movement practice of Jiu Jitsu, and I felt like I was losing my mind. And I just felt this extreme pull to get back in touch with something real. And it doesn't get more real than being 12 feet, 18 feet up in a tree on a freezing cold November morning, hoping something is going to walk underneath your stand. And, when you do this from a young age and we kind of come to it in a naive place, you just think it's normal. You think that the brutality and the violence of hunting is normal, just like the brutality and the violence of the fight sports are normal to the naive hunter, to the naive fighter. But they're really not. And I think that was something that I realized right away, even as like a 13-year-old kid, that I'm different from a lot of the people that I'm out there with. Like, I don't glamorize the violence. Like, hunting is really ugly. A lot of things can go wrong, especially when you bow hunt like I do. Ultimately, the way I look at this from an ethical standpoint is that I like to know where my food comes from. I like to know how my food died. I'd like to know what the quality of their life was. And the fact of the matter is that every deer I've ever taken, they've been free range, organic, living on a natural diet. And they had one bad day. They had one bad day where something went wrong. And fortunately, they've all died quickly. And you compare that to the life of a cow on a factory farm in a place like Texas, for example, and it's a radically different experience. But none of that really takes away the shame from me of having blood on my hands, of doing this doing this dirty, vile deed, essentially, of taking a life. It's not something that I take lightly, and it's not something that I glorify or glamorize, but it's at the same time, like if you see the photo that accompanies this episode, there's a real joy in the pursuit of food. I mean, if you think about the satisfaction that comes from having a beautiful meal with people you love, like that's amazing. It's even better when you provide the food. Maybe you cooked it yourself. Maybe you used an old family recipe and you're gathering the people you love around them and sharing with you. There's another layer of joy that gets built in on top of that when you know exactly how that whole process went down from start to finish. And that's how I relate to this whole thing. But anyway, to kind of connect it to everything I just talked about like feeling this need to stretch and feeling lopsided and feeling out of my depth, I needed to go into nature and feel awe. So Friday night came around. This was going to be our last chance before a cold front moved in and rained heavily for a few days. So my friend Eric and I went out, and it was a wild night in the woods. I always say that, going into the woods, especially to hunt, is a lot like going into a jiu-jitsu match, because like no two nights in the woods, no 2 days in the woods, no 2 jiu-jitsu matches are the same. If you go in with any sorts of presuppositions in your mind, then you're going to be disappointed and you're going to be caught off guard because nothing goes according to plan. This is something that Emily and I talked about on our most recent Highest Levels episode, which I don't know was out yet, but yeah, every night in the woods, every morning in the woods is completely different, and you have to go in just ready to receive it. You can't go in playing out any kind of script. And that was exactly what happened. I just went to the spot that I thought was going to be good based on what the wind direction was looking at like, and based on how I knew deer were moving through the area. So yeah, I'm in the stand around 4:30. There are a couple of does picking their way along this field edge, browsing. I don't recall what they were eating at the time. They were eating leaves off these low-hanging branches, and I need to figure out what they were eating, but they seemed to enjoy it. And I'm watching them come in, and I'm thinking, okay, this is great. I might get a shot at one of these deer. And to their left is this broad expanse of cornfield. And all of a sudden, I hear rushing through the corn, and I see, like, picture high grass and a snake slithering through the grass, kind of disrupting it in that wave-like formation. That's what I see out of the corner of my eye, this brief flash. I think, oh, that was odd. And then suddenly the 3 or 4 does come charging by my stand, and behind them is this this 4-point buck. So picture awkward teenager version of a deer, which thematically is appropriate. This awkward teenager busts through, and I'm feeling very much like an awkward teenager in this one domain of my life. And he's just fired up. Like one of these does is clearly ready for breeding, and he thinks he has a chance, and he's just chasing them all over the place. And I had 2 shot opportunities at this deer, and ultimately I passed. And I passed on it for good reasons. I think are good reasons. The first reason is that when Cormac was born, he was maybe like 2 or 3 months old, and I was out hunting one morning, and in the part of the state that I hunt, you have to shoot a doe before you take a buck in the early season. It was still early season. So I shoot what I thought was a doe. I go and I collect it, and it turns out it's a young buck without antlers. And I just felt devastated because that was the last thing I want to do. Like biologically, it makes more sense to kill mature bucks later in the breeding season because they've already kind of fulfilled their biological needs. It makes little to no sense to kill a young male at the beginning of his life like that, like before they're of breeding age. So I felt awful about that. So bad to the point that like I used every scrap of that deer that I could, like things I wouldn't ordinarily eat, I ate, just because I was so broken up about it. And then, the second reason I tend to pass on younger bucks is because, they have just like any other young person, like they have their whole life ahead of them. There's something to me kind of tragic about killing a male that early, or really it could be a female too, about killing any animal that early in its life cycle, before they've sort of supported and given more back to their population. So I passed on this 4-point, and I was texting my hunting partner about it and texting one of my friends about it. And I said, I'm probably going to end up regretting that. Um, the only deer I saw all last season was a 4-point that I passed on. And then the next day I got hit by a car. I was dead on the side of the road. So here I am thinking this is exactly what's going to happen all over again. The rest of the evening passes. There's 20 minutes before dark. And I see out of the corner of my eye this bigger, more mature buck picking its way through the woods, maybe about 40 or 50 yards in the distance. And immediately I'm thinking like, okay, so one of those does must have been an estrus. He smells it. He's coming this way. So I get myself ready. I draw the bow back, and this deer's just coming at me straight ahead. I have no shot because he's facing me directly. Generally, you want a deer to be broadside or quartering away from you. So eventually he sees me and he just locks eyes at me. We had this eerie stare down that went on for like maybe 15 seconds. The whole time I'm just holding this bow back, and I shoot a pretty heavy bow. It's like a 70-pound draw weight. When you're holding back a compound bow, it's like a fraction of that, but it's still tiring to hold the thing. And I'm just looking at my watch. I'm like, okay, I got 10 minutes to make the shot. What's this deer going to do? Finally, it angles slightly toward me, and I release the arrow, and it's so dark at this point that like I can't see where the arrow goes. I just hear hard impact, and I know I hit it. I just don't know where. And immediately I start to get the shakes, but that fades because I've been through this many times, and I know exactly what comes next, which is really the hard part, which is tracking and recovering, hopefully. So long story short is I let an hour pass by before I get down out of the tree and look for the arrow, and there is no arrow because the arrow is still inside the deer, and there's no blood for the first 100 yards. So here I am once again, this awkward teenager, completely out of my depth, not knowing what to do. Well, I know what to do, but I'm kind of just feeling like I don't have what it takes to meet this moment. And the reasonable sort of self-doubting voice in my head is telling me, okay, just back out, come back in the morning, hire a tracker, do whatever you got to do to recover this deer. But there was something deeper inside of me calling me to rise to this moment and recover this animal myself, believing that I could do it, even though there was no blood sign for the first 100 yards and there was no arrow for the first 100 yards. So something deep inside of me was pulling me forward, saying, go for it, reach for it. He's out there. You can do this. So Eric and I start picking our way slowly through the dark. By this time, it's pitch black. And eventually we find our first spot of blood, and then another, and then another. And we find it and we lose the trail, and we find it and we lose the trail. And eventually we hit this spot where we're just like totally stumped. Don't know where this deer went. And we're picking our way along this shallow creek bed. And eventually I see fresh tracks in the creek, and I see just a ton of blood at the top of the far side of this creek bed. And I knew that was this deer's sort of last gasp, was this push to run up this hill. And 20 yards later, we found him. And the moment you see in the photo that accompanies this episode, this sort of like look of pure, unbridled joy on my face is not a joy at taking a life. It's not a joy or a glorification of the brutality of bloodshed in hunting. It's really the joy that you're seeing is that same joy I discussed about providing for one's family and the people they love, and also just about unlocking something deep inside of myself, this obstruction, this feeling that I can't possibly stretch to meet this moment. It was a beautiful way of thematically training that need to level up. And it's no different than Jiu Jitsu. This is ultimately what I talk about when I talk about thematic training in the art of Jiu Jitsu. We can train this thing locally and just use it as a way of beating people up, of being the toughest guy or gal in the room, of losing weight. All of these different things are either noble or ignoble for different reasons, just like hunting is either noble or ignoble for different reasons. But I feel like if you're looking at it just from any one of these singular dimensions, you're kind of missing you're missing the greater payoff. And that's what this experience was all about to me. It was about this greater experience of stretching to meet this moment and digging deep inside of myself to pull off something that I couldn't have done otherwise. And I've had that same revelation on the mats, and I've had that same revelation in the woods. And this time it just came in the woods, and I'm so grateful for it. And after that, my night didn't end that night until like 1 a.m. or something like that. Like Eric and I still had to drag this 150-pound deer, like 600 yards out of the woods. And, this is one I will remember for the rest of my life. This is my first really decent public land buck. We had to work super hard for it. And all of that's great, but what I will remember ultimately most about this deer and this whole experience, and how I will kind of honor its life and deeply in my own way convey my sense of gratitude toward this animal as it sustains me and my family for the next probably like 6 months or so, is thanking it for the energy it provides us, but also thanking it for the transformation that it afforded in us. And it's tragic that transformation had to come at the expense of life, but we all have to eat, and life eats life. It's just kind of an unfortunate biological fact on this planet. But I think we can all make decisions to eat more consciously, and that's ultimately what brings me to hunting, and that's ultimately what brings me to this episode today. But yeah, I have a feeling that this episode is going to shake loose a lot of strong emotional responses, both positive and negative. But one of the big things that called me to doing this podcast in general was something that Emily encouraged me to do, and that's let people see under the hood. Let people know who you are. Let people experience things as you experience them. And that's going to push away some people. It's going to pull in a lot of others. But I hope that you've at least suspended judgment up until this point. And I hope that maybe some of these things are ideas you've never considered for yourself. And I hope that maybe it's something you look at a little bit differently. And then my overarching hope is that we can all just think a bit more consciously about what we eat, how we eat, and where it comes from. That's really all I have for you this week on BJJ Meditations. As always, the best way now to do everything BJJ Meditations related is at bjjmeditations.com. That's where you can go to book in-person or online coaching with me. That's the best way to support me and the podcast. You can also make a donation directly to Venmo. If you like, you can read the essays that often underpin these episodes, and you could sign up for the mailing list to receive essays when they are out via email. The other thing I wanted to encourage you to do is check out the Highest Levels podcast with me and Emily on BJJ Mental Models Premium. You can sign up for a free trial for BJJ Mental Models. I think it's 7 days, and then if you like it, you can pay or you can not pay. Other than that, you want to support BJJ Meditations, you can like, subscribe, review, and share wherever you're listening to or watching this. And you can also read me on Substack. That's johanna.substack.com. I'm probably going to write something from a different angle about this whole experience, just because it was a really profound one for me. And then, of course, you can come train at Princeton Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. We welcome visitors from all schools, all affiliations, every walk of life. We love just to meet you. If you are listening to BJJ Mental Models or BJJ Meditations and you happen to be in the New Jersey or the New York area, it's like we're about like an hour and change by train from New York City. Definitely come on down. Would love to meet you. Would love to talk to you about anything jiu-jitsu or life related. But yeah, that's it. That's all I've got for this week, folks. Thanks for listening, and we will talk soon.